Chapter 9, Mr. Quimby's Spunky Gal. Filled with spirit and pluck, Ramona started off to school with her lunchbox in her hand. She was determined that today would be different. She would make it different. She was her father's spunky gal, wasn't she? She twirled around for the pleasure of making her pleated skirt stand out beneath her car coat. Ramona was so filled with spunk, she decided to go to school a different way. By the next street over, something she's always wanted to do. The distance to Glenwood School was no greater. There was no reason she should not go to school any way she pleased as long as she looked both ways before she crossed the street and did not talk to strangers. Slowpoke Howie, half a block behind, called out when he saw her turn the corner. "Ramona, where are you going?" "I'm going to school a different way," Ramona called back, certain that Howie would not follow to spoil her feeling of adventure. Howie was not a boy to change his ways. Ramona skipped happily down the street, singing to herself, "Hippity-hop to the barber shop to buy a stick of candy. One for you, one for me, and one for my sister Mandy." The sky through the bare branches overhead was clear, the air was crisp, and Ramona's feet in their brown Oxfords felt light. Beeze's old boots, which so often weighed her down, were home in the hall closet. Ramona was happy. The day felt different already. Ramona turned the second corner as she hippity-hopped down the unfamiliar street past 3 white houses and a tan stucco house. She enjoyed a feeling of freedom and adventure. Then as she passed a gray shingle house in the middle of the block, a large German shepherd dog, license tags jingling, darted down the driveway toward her. Terrified, Ramona stood rooted to the sidewalk. She felt as if her bad dream had come true. The grass was green, the sky was blue. She could not move. She could not scream. The dog, head thrust forward, came close. He sniffed with his black nose. Here was a stranger. He growled. This was his territory, and he did not want a stranger to trespass. This is not a dream, Ramona told herself. This is real. My feet will move if I make them. Go away, she ordered, backing away from the dog, which answered with a sharp bark. He had teeth like the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood. "Oh, grandmother, what a big teeth you have, the better to eat you with, my dear." Ramona took another step back. Growling, the dog advanced. He was a dog, not a wolf, but that was bad enough. Ramona used the only weapon she had, her lunchbox. She slung her lunchbox at the dog and missed. The box crashed to the sidewalk, tumbled, and came to rest. The dog stopped to sniff it. Ramona forced her feet to move, to run. Her Oxford pounded on the sidewalk. One shoelace came untied and slapped against her ankle. She looked desperately at a passing car, but the driver did not notice her peril. Ramona cast a terrified look over her shoulder. The dog had lost interest in her unopened lunchbox and was coming toward her again. She could hear his toenails on the sidewalk and could hear him growling deep in his throat. She had to do something, but what? Ramona's heart was pounding in her ears as she stopped to reach for the only weapon left, her shoe. She had no choice. She yanked off her brown Oxford and hurled it at the dog. Again she missed. The dog stopped, sniffed the shoe, and then, to Ramona's horror, picked it up. And trotted off into the direction which he had come. Ramona stood aghast with the cold from the concrete sidewalk, seeping through her sock. Now what would she do? If she said, "You come back here," the dog might obey, and then she didn't want him any closer. She watched helplessly as he returned to his own lawn, where he settled down with the shoe and began between his paws like a bone, and he began to gnaw. Her shoe! There was no way Ramona could take her shoe away from the dog by herself. There was no one she could ask for help on this street of strangers. And her blue lunchbox, now dented, lying there on the sidewalk. Did she dare try to go get it back while the dog was busy chewing her shoe? She took a cautious step toward her lunchbox. The dog went on gnawing. She took another step. "I'm really brave," she told herself. The dog looked up. Ramona froze. The dog began to gnaw again. She darted forward, grabbed her lunchbox, and ran to school. Splat, pat, on the cold concrete. Ramona refused to cry. She was brave, wasn't she? But she was worried. Mrs. Griggs frowned on tardiness when Ramona was quite sure she expected everyone in the class to wear 2 shoes. Ramona would probably catch it from Mrs. Griggs at school and her mother at home for losing a shoe without a wear left in it. Ramona was always catching it. When Ramona reached Glenwood School, the bell rung and the traffic boys were leaving their post. The children crowding into the building did not notice Ramona's predicament. Ramona splatted down the hall, room 1, where she quickly left her lunchbox and car coat in the cloakroom before she sat down at her desk with one foot folded under her. She split her pleated skirt to hide her dirty sock. Susan noticed. "What happened to your other shoe?" she asked. "I lost it, and don't you tell." If Susan told, Ramona would have to have a good excuse to pull Susan. If Susan told, Ramona would have a good excuse to pull her curls. "I won't," promised Susan. "Please, please to share a secret, but how are you going to keep Mrs. Griggs from finding out?" Ramona cast a desperate look at Susan. "I don't know," she confessed. "Class," said Mrs. Griggs in a calm voice. This was her way of saying, "All right, everyone quiet down and come to order because we have work to do, and we won't accomplish anything if we waste time talking to one another." Ramona tried to warm her cold foot by rubbing it through her pleated skirt. Mrs. Griggs looked around her classroom. "Who has not had a turn at leading the flag salute?" she asked. Ramona stared at her desk while trying to shrink so small Mrs. Griggs could not see her. "Ramona, you've not had a turn," said Mrs. Griggs. "You may come to the front of the room." Ramona and Susan exchanged a look. Ramona said, "Now what am I going to do?" Susan said, "I feel sorry for you." "Ah, Ramona, we're waiting," said Mrs. Griggs. There was no escape. Ramona slid from her seat, walked to the front of the room where she faced the flag and stood on one foot like a stork to hide her shoeless foot behind her skirt. "I pledge allegiance," she began swaying. "I pledge allegiance," said the class. Mrs. Griggs interrupted. "Both feet on the floor, Ramona." Ramona felt a surge of defiance. Mrs. Griggs wanted 2 feet on the floor, so she put 2 feet on the floor. "To the flag," she continued with such determination that Mrs. Griggs did not have another chance to interrupt. When Ramona finished, she took her seat. "So there," Mrs. Griggs was her spunky thought. "What if I am wearing only one shoe?" "Ramona, what happened to your other shoe?" asked Miss Griggs. "I lost it," answered Ramona. "Tell me about it." Mrs. Griggs said. Ramona did not want to tell. "I was chased by a—" She wanted to say gorilla, but after a moment's hesitation she said a dog, "and I had to throw my shoe at him, and he ran off with it." She expected the class to laugh, but instead they listened in silent sympathy. They did not understand about a hole in a house, but they understood about big dogs. They too had been faced big dogs and had been frightened. Ramona felt better. "Why, that's too bad," said Mrs. Griggs, which surprised Ramona. Somehow she had not expected her teacher to understand. Mrs. Griggs continued, "I'll call the office and ask the secretary to telephone your mother and have her bring you another pair of shoes." "My mother isn't at home," said Ramona. "She's at work." "Well, don't worry, Ramona. We'll have some boots without owners in the cloakroom. You can borrow one to wear when we go for recess." Ramona was familiar with those boots, none of them related, and all of them dingy brown because no one would lose a new red boot. There's one thing Ramona did not like was old brown boots. They were really ugly. She could not run and play kickball in one shoe and one boot. Spirit and spunk surged back into Ramona. Mrs. Griggs meant well, but she did not understand about boots. Miss Benny would never have told Ramona to wear one old boot. Ramona did not want to wear an old brown boot, and she made up her mind she was not going to do that. Once Ramona made this decision, it was up to her to decide what to do. If she only had heavy paper and a stapler, she could make a slipper, one that might be strong enough to last till she reached home. She paid attention to number combinations in one part of her mind, while in the private place in the back of her mind, she thought about paper slipper and how she could make it if she only had a stapler. A stapler! Where could she get a stapler? Mrs. Griggs would want an explanation if she asked to borrow it. To borrow Miss Benny's stapler, Ramona would have to run across the playground to the temporary building, and Mrs. Griggs was sure to call her back. There'd only been another way. There had to be another way. And there was, if she could only make it work. When recess finally came, Ramona was careful to leave the room with several other members of her class and to slip down to the girls' bathroom in the basement before Mrs. Griggs could remind her to put on the boot. She jerked 4 rough paper towels out of the container by the sinks. She folded 3 of the paper towels in half, making 6 layers of rough paper. The 4th towel she folded into thirds, which also made 6 layers of paper. Now came the scary part of her plan. Ramona but returned to the hall, which was empty because both first grades were out on the playground. The doors of the classrooms were closed. No one would see the brave thing she was about to do. Ramona climbed the stairs to the first landing where she paused to take a fresh grip on her courage. She'd never gone up to the upstairs hall alone. First graders rarely ventured there unless accompanied by their parents on open house night. She felt small and frightened, but she held fast to her courage as she ran up the second half of the flight of stairs. Ramona found Mr. Cardozo's room. She quietly opened the door a crack. Mr. Cardozo was telling his class, "Spelling secretary is easy. Just remember the first part is secret, and think of a secretary as someone who keeps secrets. You will never again spell the word with two A's instead two E's." Ramona opened the door a little wider and peeked inside. How big the desk looked compared to room 1. She heard the whir of a wheel spinning in a mouse cage. Mr. Cardozo came to investigate. He opened the door. "Hello, Ramona Q. What may we do for you?" There was Ramona standing on one foot, trying to hide her dirty sock behind her shoe, while Beezus' whole class, and especially Beezus, stared at her. Besides her classmates, Beezus did not look so big as Ramona had always thought her to be. Ramona was secretly pleased to discover her sister was a little less than medium-sized. Ramona wondered how Beezus would report this scene at home. "Mother." The door opened and there was Ramona standing with one shoe on. Ramona refused to let her courage fail her. She remembered her manners and said, "May I please borrow your stapler? I can use it right here in the hall and it will only take a minute." Once again she had that strange feeling of standing aside to look at herself. Was she a funny little girl who Mr. Cardozo would just find amusing? Apparently not, because he did not hesitate. "Certainly," he said, and he went to his desk for a stapler and he handed it to her without question. Mrs. Griggs would have said, "Tell me why you want it, Ramona." Miss Benny would have said, "Won't you let me help you with it?" But Mr. Cardozo closed the door, leaving Ramona in the privacy of the hall. Ramona knelt on the floor and went to work. She stapled the 3 paper towels together. The folded the towel folded in thirds, she placed at one end of the other towels and stapled it on 3 sides to make the toe of the slipper. She had to push down hard with both hands to force the staples through so much paper. Then she turned her stapler over and sent staples through the other direction to make it stronger. There! Ramona slid her foot into the slipper. With one more time and a pair of scissors, she could have made a better slipper with rounded toe, but this slipper was better than an old boot and should last all day. School paper towels being what they were. Ramona opened the door again and held out the stapler. Mr. Cardozo looked up and walked over to her. "Thank you, Mr. Cardozo," she said, because she knew he expected good manners. "You're welcome, Ramona Q," said Mr. Cardozo with a smile that was a friendly smile, not an amused by a funny little girl smile. "We're always glad to help." Ramona had not felt so happy since she was in kindergarten. Too bad Beezus had first dibs on Mr. Cardozo. Ramona might have married him herself someday if she ever decided to get married. She reached room 1 just as the 2 first grades were returning from recess. She heard someone from room 2 say, "Ramona must have hurt her foot." Someone said, "I bet it hurts." Ramona began to limp. She was enjoying the attention the slipper attracted. "Oh, there you are, Ramona," said Mrs. Griggs, who was standing by her door. "Where have you been? We missed you on the playground." "I was making a slipper." Ramona looked up. "I don't want to wear a dirty old boot." She had to not feel so brave since the day she started off the first grade. "After this, you should ask permission to stay in at recess." Mrs. Griggs looked down. "You've made a very good slipper." Encouraged by the bit of praise, Ramona said, "I could make a better slipper if I had scissors and crowns. I could draw a bunny face on the toe and make it look like a real bunny slipper." Mrs. Griggs' expression was thoughtful. She seemed to be studying Ramona, who shrank inside herself, uncertain as to what her teacher might be about to say. Mrs. Griggs looked more tired than cross. "Maybe I could finish my slipper instead of making a Thanksgiving turkey." "We always," began Mrs. Griggs, and changed her mind. "I don't see why not," she said. Mrs. Griggs approved of her. Ramona smiled with relief and pretended to limp to her seat as her teacher closed the door. She no longer had to dread turkeys or her teacher. The class took out their arithmetic workbook. While Ramona began to count cowboy boots and butterflies and circled the correct number under the picture, she was busy and happy in the private corner of her mind planning improvements in her slipper. She would round the heel and toe, and she'd draw a nose and a pink crown and eyes, too, and cut 2 ears. Ramona's happy thoughts were interrupted by another less happy thought. Her missing brown Oxford. What was her mother going to say when she came home without it? Tell her she was careless? Tell her how much shoes cost these days? Ask her why on earth she didn't go to school the usual way? Because I was feeling full of spunk, Ramona answered in her thoughts. Her father would understand. She hoped her mother would too. Workbooks were collected. Reading circles were next. Prepared to attack words, Ramona limped to a little chair in the front room with the rest of her reading group. She felt so much better towards Mrs. Griggs, and she was the first to raise her hand on almost every question, even though she's worried about her missing Oxford. The reader was more interesting now that her group was attacking bigger words. Fire engine. Ramona read to herself and thought, "Pow, I got you, fire engine. Monkey. Pow, I got you, monkey." The buzz of the little black telephone beside Mrs. Griggs' desk interrupted in room 1. Everyone wanted to listen to Mrs. Griggs talk to the principal's office, but they might hear something important. "Yes," said Mrs. Griggs. "Yes, we do." With the receiver pressed to her ear, and she turned away from the telephone and looked at Ramona. Everyone else in room 1 looked at her too. Now what? Thought Ramona. Now what have I done? All right, said Mrs. Griggs to the telephone. I'll send her along. She replaced the receiver. Room 1. Most of all, Ramona waited. "Ramona, your shoe's waiting for you in the office," said the teacher. "When the dog's owner found it on the lawn, he brought it to the school, and the secretary guessed it was a first grader. You may be excused to go get it." "Oh, whew," thought Ramona in great relief as she limped happily to the office. This day was turning out better than she'd ever expected. She accepted her shoe, now interestingly scarred with tooth marks from Mrs. Miller, the school secretary. "My goodness," said Mrs. Miller as Ramona shoved her foot into her shoe and tied the lace, still damp from being chewed, in a tight bow. "Good thing your foot came out of your shoe when the dog got a hold of it. He must have had pretty big teeth." "He did," Ramona assured the secretary. "Great big teeth, look like a wolf. He chased me." Now that Ramona was safe in her shoes, she was eager for an audience. "He chased me, but I took off my shoe and threw it at him, and that stopped him." "Fancy that!" Mrs. Miller was plainly impressed by Ramona's story. "You took off your shoe and threw it at him. You must be a brave little girl." "I guess I am," said Ramona, pleased by the compliment. Of course she was brave. She had scars on her shoe to prove it. She hoped her mother would not be in too much of a hurry to hide the tooth marks with fresh shoe polish. She hippity-hopped, paper slipped in hand, down the hall to room 1. Brave Ramona, that's what they would think. Just about the bravest girl in the whole first grade. And they would be right. This time, Ramona was sure. And that is the end of the book.